Welcome back, everybody, to Dungeon Brew. John and I are continuing our series on balancing encounters. Stay tuned.
Welcome to Dungeon Brew.
Welcome back, everybody, to Dungeon Brew. John and I are going to be talking about balancing encounters for your Tier 3 party members. These are folks that fall between the levels of 11 and 16. So we're going to be exploring on how you start setting up combat and encounters in general with these parties. Before we get started on this, please hit that like and subscribe button. We really appreciate it. All right, John, so where do you want to start this conversation at? We've gone through Tier 1, we've gone through Tier 2. Tier 3, I feel like things start getting a little bit more dicey as the GM.
Yeah, there's kind of this variance that opens up the higher level you get, right? So, Tier 1, you're really narrow in terms of the power level, the amount of wiggle room you have in terms of the threats that the party can handle, that type of thing. Tier 2, we'd start to widen back up, and Tier 3, we get bigger still. Mm-hmm. Went off camera. But like that variance exists because classes, as well as 5th edition does in balancing classes, which is much better than many of the previous editions, you still have this dichotomy that exists between a fighter or a barbarian and a wizard or a cleric or a druid, just in terms of the sheer amount of influence that those types of classes that can have on a game. A party of 3 or 4, or a party of 4 fighters versus a party of 4 wizards are two completely different things in terms of the amount of power, the amount of influence, the amount of options that they can bring to the table, particularly if fighters don't have magic items that allow them to accomplish specific tasks. So if they don't have the ability to fly, then they're having trouble encountering flying opponents, that type of thing. These are just things that you need to be aware of as a DM when you're going into balancing your encounters. If you've got a more terrestrial party that does not have the magic or the ability to close the distance with particular types of opponents, then you're going to have a more difficult encounter, say, than if you're just facing a massive swath of terrestrial bound opponents that the party can engage with in toe-to-toe combat. So keep those things in mind, I think, initially when you're looking at trying to balance what type of characters did your players choose to bring into play, and what are the capabilities or what are the versatilities that they have available to them.
Yeah, I honestly usually struggle at the other end of that spectrum where I give my party members too many magic items prior to level 11, and so they come up and just like wipe the floor of the monsters that are available to me once I start getting into the CR levels. But I really do appreciate you pointing out that there does take some preparation in getting your party ready to come into this tier. Right. Because as you start breaking down the monsters that are available there, whether we're talking about young dragons or some of the golems that are available, or the more intense demons and devils that come in at these levels, you really have to start reading through their abilities, what they can accomplish on the battlefield, and making sure that your players are ready to face that level of threat. Because again, if you don't reward them with the magic items to be able to maneuver around in that combat, they're going to get creamed. And so your other option then is just having them fighting larger parties of lower CR levels until they can acquire the actual magical items to face their opponents that are on the battlefield.
Yeah, and magic items are a good way of closing that gap. If you really want your party to be able to face off against an elite group of evil 𝐥𝐤𝐤𝐤, you have to give them the ability to face that opponent. Whether that's giving them magical ranged type weapons, whether it's giving them boots or whatever of flying, like things that allow them to close that gap, or just anything that is going to assist them in doing that. It's the same thing you would think of if you're going, we're going to do an underwater encounter. You can't just drop your players in the middle of the ocean and not give them any ability to breathe or swim.
It'll just be a short campaign.
True. But those are the types of things you just kind of need to be aware of, or at the very least, if you're going to include those types of things and you want that to be part of the tactical challenge, give them tools on the battlefield to be able to handle those types of challenges challenges as well. Just don't put them in an open field with the 𝐸𝐸𝐸 swirling overhead, firing bows down at them, or firing arrows down at them. They can't close the distance. They can't get up there. And this is particularly true with your party of like 4 fighters. They may not have the dexterity necessary to make the attacks and hit their opponents, or they may not have even brought a ranged weapon with them. Or they may have brought a ranged weapon that's a thrown weapon that doesn't have the ability to, get 90 feet into the air to go, handle an opponent. All of those things are important. Go ahead.
I was just going to say, I know as well when it comes to this tier level, it's more, maybe I'm just speaking out of my own experience, but I feel like it's more likely that you're going to present more medium and hard encounters for the party than you are the easier encounters that they would maybe face at this level. And a lot of that for me is because there are so many abilities that start coming online that are at the party's disposal that combat takes longer if you start filling the field with tons of like little enemies for them to take out. And so I oftentimes am looking at bigger monsters in less number for them to take on. So my battles become more of the hard type that they're facing, while still keeping in mind that I'm only wanting my party to have about 10,500 to 20,000 experience per day for whatever they're experiencing. But it's much smaller battles with fewer enemies that are much larger.
Yeah, so there's a couple of things in there that I think are important. One is you're right. Your combat takes longer. This is just due to the way that health hit HP bloat occurs in 5th edition or in Dungeons and Dragons in general. This is the primary way that balance is achieved for higher level enemies. They're given more hit points in the same way that the player characters are given more hit points, because having a higher AC generally feels bad because there's less hits that occur. And so instead of going, well, they're really difficult to hit and you're just missing really often, the design was, well, let them go ahead and hit as often as they've always hit with their 3 attacks now for something like a fighter. We get 3 attacks where we're doing, Great Weapon Master, we're doing 20 damage a hit, we're doing 60 damage a round, and we're doing this insane amount of damage. We can't have the enemy fall over flat in the first round, so instead of giving them a high AC, they just give them a ton of hit points, and it makes the game last for a really long time, makes combat last a really long time. So it is important to recognize that, and your approach is correct, because more opponents mean that you also have to have more actions. There's more from the GM side of allocating where various people are located, various NPCs are located, where the PCs are directing their attention. If you want to have your 4 level 11 party members facing off against a CR11 encounter, it is much easier to do a CR5 and a CR6 or one CR11 opponent than it is to do 11 CR1 opponents. There's so much more action that has to occur. There's so much more attention that everybody has to play, and it takes more time. So it's the direction I go as well. Whenever I start putting together encounters, I much prefer having fewer opponents or one big opponent with a couple of smaller opponents with them. But that variance gives you a lot of leeway in terms of difficulty, because oftentimes 2 CR6 enemies are more difficult than 1 CR12 enemy. You can have 2 Driders on the battlefield, which are far more difficult than just having 1 Aaron Yes. Those are going to be different difficulties, and it doesn't really measure out the same way. And I'm fairly certain, I don't know the H or the XP on both of those off the top of my head, but I think that the 2 CR6s are actually fewer XP than the 1 CR12 anyway, so that's also a factor to keep in mind.
Yeah, and I think that sounds about right, especially when I'm considering, like, most of these battles, you're looking at between, like, 3,000 and 5,000 XP a battle is what you're doing with these. So where we talked before with the lower level, the lower level tiers, where we're talking about the lower level tiers and the amount of experience that they're gaining, and the fights having, multiple enemies, and they may be having multiple encounters a day. What was it, like 8 encounters in a day? Usually when I get into these levels of gameplay, I'm looking at like 4 encounters a day, which is probably a little bit atypical from what people would generally think of when they're coming into these types of battles. It's just far fewer, right? I'm having like 3 or 4 encounters, having about 3,000 or 4,000 experience with a couple of enemies that are coming into it, and then letting it go and moving on to the next day.
Well, and it really comes down to the pacing that the group wants for their game. You know, do you want to have a longer campaign or longer adventuring days? I think in typical gaming groups play between 2 and 4 hours at a time. They don't tend to play any longer or shorter than that. So 2 to 4 hours when you're talking about a single combat encounter, especially a difficult one at that level. A single combat encounter can take you between 30 minutes and an hour and a half. So it can take up to half, if not more than half, of your actual game session to get through a single encounter. And that can be kind of tedious at this level to try and get your entire group to move forward. It's like, okay, we're supposed to be having 6 encounters today. You know, the first one took an hour. We still have 5 more encounters to go through. And you just don't feel like you're making any progress. Whereas, you know, tier 1, we're talking about fighting off a few kobolds or goblins. It might take 15-20 minutes at most to get through that combat encounter. And you're able to get through all of those combat encounters and move on to the next day and maybe get through all of those combat encounters as well before you're ready to move on.
Well, and that's part of... I have an ulterior motive for this, viewers. Like, really, when it comes to gameplay at these levels. Because honestly, in my mind, we have been playing a game, a ttrpg, for many months coming up into getting into tier 3. We've all had these long battles and these encounters that have been going on for some time. And at this level, there's also the balance, which I know is not part of balancing encounters, but it's balancing the amount of fun that you're having in playing the game.
Right.
And none of us like coming in for a gaming session that's going to go 4 hours, and because the combat takes so long, you end up swinging your sword 6 times in 4 hours, waiting for your turn to come around because of all the enemies and all of the players that are around the table. And so it's something that you have to consider once you get into tier 3 is how do you keep combat moving and how do you keep players engaged so, you know, John doesn't have to leave and go to the bathroom for, 20 minutes and knows that his round isn't even going to be back by the time he gets back to the table.
Yeah, because I have a lot of problems. I'm going to be in there for the full 20 minutes. Yeah, no, I agree, and this is going back towards sometimes defaulting toward fewer enemies on the battlefield or fewer players on the just like actors on the battlefield is going to be better for the speed of the game than just putting out these mass quantities of enemies. But I think that we've kind of beat the dead horse on this one a little bit. So I do want to shift gears just into the idea of what you can do in terms of balancing. We've talked about action economy for tier 2. Tier 3, this becomes more prevalent again. You get a lot more enemies that have legendary actions. So you have vampire lords, mummy lords, dragons. You're fighting adult dragons, pretty much all of them for the most part, except for like a golden red fall slightly outside of this. But you fall into these legendary actions because this is the area where action economy has really come like fully online, except for the which I think even at 16th level is when the fighter gets their 4th attack. So fighters are getting their 3rd attack at level 11, they're getting their 4th attack at level 16. This is where we're accessing 6th, 7th, and 8th level spells. So we're getting into this place where power levels have gone very, very high. There's very little left. When we get into tier 4, there's not a whole lot left in terms of what is accessible in terms of power. And this is mostly, again, the design standpoint because Wizards did their polls and they determined most people want to play levels 2 and 3, or tiers 2 and 3, and so that's why tier 3 is where the apex of a lot of these things occur. There's still some capstone abilities in tier 4, but they're kind of they're not as important.
They're like throwaways.
Yeah. So all of those things being said, there's a lot more variance. A level 11 party is fully capable of taking on a CR 16, CR 17, CR 18 in the same way that a level 16 party can handle a CR 20, depending again on the experience of your group, the composition of the group, the various things that you've chosen to give them in terms of magic items. But there's this huge variability in terms of what can the party handle. They can handle actually quite a lot, and it's not uncommon to come across posts and forums and things like that about how a DM comes in and says, "Oh, I had this epic encounter with this dragon and all of this other stuff, and my party was only level 12, and they completely wiped the floor with the encounter that I had set up because they have so many options at their disposal.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I'm trying to think of anything else to add specifically onto that, but all that is very true. And again, it goes back to kind of the initial point that we made, which is probably my hardest point from a GM standpoint, is when you're setting up your battles, know what your monsters can do and make sure that your party has the resources to take them on. And as long as those two things remain true, your party's probably going to be able to handle whatever it is. That for me is the biggest balancing piece with it. But you're right, even your low-level parties, which you do this to us a lot, at level 12 or 13, you can throw a 16, 17 CR creature at us, and we'll knock it out because of the experience in fighting those types of creatures, and you make sure that we have the things in our inventory, if we remember they're there, to be able to utilize them and take on the monster.
Yeah, no, that's definitely true. And I just do want to point out, we talked about this in the previous video. We've talked a lot about specific tactics for specific monsters, and we did an entire video on dragons. Dragons are a difficult opponent, but they're only as difficult as the DM makes them. And this is very important because, and I'm talking about this generally, because when we talk about the encounter difficulty and balancing encounters, it has as much to do with terrain and it has as much to do with the features of that terrain as it does to do with the monsters that you put in place. So a dragon standing in the middle of an open room that never flies is not a very difficult opponent. It's going to get its breath weapon off. It may even knock a couple of people if they have particularly low health or they fail their saves or something else like that. But it's going to get 1 or 2 rounds of attacks before the party just tears through it if you aren't properly preparing your terrain and properly preparing the lair in which that monster appears. This is true of almost every single monster when you're getting into tier 3. They just don't have the longevity to stand toe-to-toe with the party if they're not designed to do that. You're going to have the golems. Like, the golems definitely are a little bit tankier, and they work fine as a medium encounter if they're just fighting against this golem. But if you want this to be an epic and difficult encounter, you have to include other options. Don't put the stone golem in there by himself. Give him some lackeys that are going to pull the attention of the party and help to balance the action economy, because otherwise he's just going to get mowed down in a round or two, and it's not a very difficult encounter. But this is also something that you want to keep in mind when you're talking about multiple encounters per day. Fighting a stone golem 6 times per day is going to tax the party in terms of the amount of resources that they're spending in fighting that opponent. You have to decide where you want to do that. Are you going to have multiple waves? Are you going to have multiple throwaway encounters that you can include or you can discard depending on how difficult the encounters have been for the party so far? These are all things that we covered in the tier 2 as well, but these are things that you do need to pay attention to when you're talking about encounter balance.
I do want to give a little bit of a bonus information that you and I haven't previously talked about, but it's something that we both do fairly frequently in having CR monsters that match the CR of the party overall, or the level of the party overall, in really considering action economy. And one of the things that you and I will both do is we insert things within the course of the battle that steals from the party's action economy, particularly like puzzles. We will make the party have to essentially accomplish certain tasks, like taking out, magical gems that create force fields or that protect the enemy or to give them some sort of buff. So if you are fighting a stone golem in an open room, typically a 4-man party is going to wipe it out. But if I have multiple puzzles you have to work through, and it steals from my fighter, or it steals from my mage, or steals from my cleric's action that round because they have to engage in a task in order to help overcome it, it makes that monster a little bit more difficult to overcome. And so I think that at this level, which you can do this at lower levels too, but at this level, it can be a lot of fun to start using terrain and using puzzles and using additional tactical things in order to help balance out the combat.
Yeah, and this is really good. We were talking about golems, so like your flesh golem in terms of it taking lightning damage, or you have an iron golem in a room where the floor is lava, because why not? We were all 5 once. So you put which this was Baldur's Gate 3. They had something similar to this, but the idea is that iron golems heal whenever they take fire damage. So you make the floor fire, and then you have the Iron Golem walking around and basically self-healing every round. And this is where you're talking about taking from the action economy. Maybe the party can beat down the Golem and overcome the amount of fire damage that it's taking every round. But you also put mechanisms into play that allow the party to spend their actions to remove the fire floor, self-healing aspect of the encounter. But it takes away from their action economy, it prolongs the battle a little bit more, and it allows for there to be another aspect to the difficulty. Those types of things are fun and innovative ways to get your party to do more than just stand toe-to-toe with the enemy and try and beat it down.
And I think that that's what is really exciting about late Tier 2 and even Tier 3 is that you start stepping into a place where it's not standing toe-to-toe anymore. I feel like early game, a lot of encounters are toe-to-toes. You're getting familiar with your guy and how to use him and what the abilities have. And as you start getting into these, it's no longer toe-to-toe. You have to be a little bit more tactical in how you're approaching every fight with these monsters at this level.
Yeah, and I think the last thing that I want to say is that the spread of monsters for Tier 3 is very limited, especially in the monster manual. I think that they've expanded this quite a bit with some of the supplementals that they put out, but the actual number of monsters for Tier 3 is quite limited. I think that there's less than 20 monsters in this area. This is where you can start pulling your Tier 2 monsters and just duplicating, like I was talking about before, a couple of Driders, that are normally CR6 are easily as difficult as one CR12. And you can easily put in, two Driders and then a couple of Drow, or you can put in 3 Driders and have it be a CR18 equivalent encounter. It becomes more difficult. It allows for more options, especially if you had monsters that the party never really faced in Tier 2 because they leveled too fast or you just didn't get to it. You can take some of those Tier 2 monsters and just add more of them, and I think that in terms of difficulty, it adds some... the difficulty remains largely the same, but it allows for more actions on the part of the enemies, and there's still quite a lot of meat for the party to try and hack through.
Or the thing that you and I have done often, and this is probably another video, but we'll take those Tier 2 monsters and we'll upscale them and add greater in front of them and make greater Driders. And make them essentially with more, a little bit...
The 3.5 method of improving everything. Everything became a greater.
Yeah, you just add a little AC, add a little HP, add a little... bring them up a damage dice and throw them in there at the party.
Nope, works perfect. All right. That's all I have.
Yeah, me too. So, thank you guys for hanging out with us again here on Dungeon Brew. Hit the like button, subscribe button, hit that little notification bell, and we will see you next time.
Dungeon Brew.